Flirts on Radio Sputnik, this show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Let's do the news. We have another great show for you today. We noted in yesterday's show the resurgence of COVID-19 in various hotspots across the United States as the rates of infection hit record highs and at the very moment that states are pushing forward with reopening. We'll continue the discussion on the coronavirus with the newest numbers, in addition to a rather fascinating CDC demographic breakdown on the rate of infection. Considering civil unrest is weirdly occurring simultaneously with a global pandemic, we'll try to elucidate the intersection between the movement for universal health care that pushed support for Medicare for All to 88% among Democrats and the broader movements taking shape outside of our window. We'll also drill down to some of the ballot races and ask whether or not candidates will be hurt by Joe Biden's top of the ticket position. Will it be a hindrance or will it be an assistance? I'm guessing the former. A little later in the hour, Bob will use his implicit quote-unquote white blessing, and I'll use whatever I can muster, of course, shy of that blessing, to talk about the megachurch pastor on the lookout for new monikers for the term white privilege. He is not digging that term. So in a recorded frank conversation on race with an African-American rapper, he floated his top pick with all the courage of an inebriated man in a dark and empty room. White blessing. We will give negative connotation, but why give it a negative connotation, right? Be positive. You're going to love this explanation. His explanation is epic. And the second hour, we're going to continue to go against the grain and get into some foreign policy news that has been trending all night, with North Korea acting out of sorts and blowing to bits a liaison center with South Korea. We'll get into why Kim Jong-un is so cross. We'll also discuss what I strongly suspect is Democrats hearing the cry of the public to defund the police and responding to that cry with a tough on crime presidential ticket. We'll also get into the strange profundity of a political system completely incapable of dealing with the energy of the Black Lives Matter movement, despite having King of Blacks, Joe Biden, and King of Black Whisperer, the mouthpiece of the very soul of America itself, South Carolina Representative James Clyburn. A black king whisperer. Last but not least, today is Tuesday. That means Politics of Art. We have an exceptional one for you today. David Chapelle put out a Netflix special that would, from a social commentary standpoint, is a man at the height of his powers. Honest, powerful, and epic. Definitely stay tuned for that one. You're going to dig that one. But let's start here. There are times where I feel I may do a disservice to my Virgoan focus on flaw and fatality. Bob and I are basically vampires. We lurch about the darkness, thrashing about in the muck, struggling with the shadows of monsters. This all belies the fact that I feel at this moment as if I am basking in the glow of the brightest day on earth. Peering over the edge of the world for a moment, we are in a forward period of confusion, the likes of which we have not seen in decades. If I were so bluntly to offer a word of advice, don't be too perturbed by the chaos. Consider it natural law asserting itself with the inner logic of our systems, provoking crisis points, express a splendid confusion. By the way, look at it in terms of inequality creating an unnatural distortion similar to a vacuum, a potential energy in a direct proportion to the degree of the injustice multiplied by the years endured. Wherever that inequality exists, be it social, economic, or political, the deficit of equality strives to be made kinetic to pacify the gap of injustice. Nature, after all, abhors a vacuum. To maintain an inelegant order of the teetering social order, the upper class invests heavily in cops and jails, reluctant to even contemplate a real solution as in any formulation of a real solution would directly and dramatically impact the accumulation and the expropriation of wealth from the unfortunate impoverished. Mind you, this represents nearly half of our population. We should also include the sizable share that is paycheck to paycheck, living one payment away from a disaster, but wouldn't be counted in the first group. Fact is, your society's workable point of view, the system and the patterns to which you have been accustomed to, worked. If it worked appropriately, millions of people wouldn't be in the streets. The energy would exist or could be processed by a political system for substantial systemic change in accordance with the shifting attitudes of the public. The last part is nearly laughable, which gets to the root of my point. It is not Pollyannish to say that a receptive government shouldn't be laughable. Something is deeply wrong with our political instrument. Chaos is the experiential tension of our society trying to extricate itself from where it is to fit into a groove of a new normal. The cross purposes of a society undergoing sudden shifts in point of view and a political instrument that has grown monstrously deaf will breed conflict, just like the conflict we are seeing out on the streets right now. What I'm getting at here is there's no point in wringing your hands over peaceful protests or riots, even if the protests take a terse turn and putrefy. Given the scale of the anonymous violence we accept as a given in our workable point of view, if we are willing to accept the inequality and the tragic human outcomes resulting from such a choice, it would be the height of irrationality to begrudge the periodic scream of a wanton destruction from an aggrieved class. Really consider your world for the moment. Extricate yourself from the human propensity for normality and look around. I know it's accepted as normal, but you don't find it profoundly weird and unsettling that your political instrument is a Frankenstein monster, with both political parties at the federal level absolutely and completely unconcerned with public sentiment? This is, after all, supposed to be a democracy, right? Or a representative government, as people say. How long do we expect that to last without resulting in disaster? Your political instrument doesn't even recognize the danger that it is currently in. Nearly 120,000 people are dead from a virus that our government apparatus had known for more than 3 months and didn't prepare for. Those deaths stains the conscience of this comic villain stupid administration. More than 2 million are infected, with the number growing by thousands every day, particularly in spots where the local governments are opening the economy, taking the lead from the president, who does not care about the fact that people are going to die in this process. The United States has 25% of the world's population in our jails. Putting aside for the moment how appalling that number is, think of the number of cases that are running through our prisons. Prisons are a breeding ground for this virus. Also, as a result of the virus, with a noxious mix of government apathy and incompetence, over 40 million people are out of a job. Nearly 40% of those jobs aren't expected to come back. As many people are out of luck with healthcare, while in the midst of a pandemic. The political party that symbolically represents the left in the United States won't support a policy with 88% support of his party backing it, and 70% of the wider population. That is near unanimity. And yet, they tell you to kick rocks. Even in the modest $1,200 that was supposed to hold back the night for all of these millions of human beings, 30 million people still getting their check. The very people who would likely need it the most. While watching people fall to desperate standards of life, our government decided that the best use of its energies was not ventilators, was not protective equipment for our frontline heroes. No! The government stood in the midst of a fire, blamed China, and looted the treasury. Going back to criminal justice for the moment, we allow explicitly racist policing policies. That is not conjecture. Nixon's crony admitted that Nixon White House started the drug war with the notion of locking up his political enemies, blacks and hippies. He couldn't necessarily criminalize being black. However, he could criminalize drug laws and working, in addition to housing, economics, banking, and loan discrimination, ensured that cops would get a disproportionate share of black bodies to toss into cages. The black hippie president, by the way, who was indeed a pot smoker, didn't do anything about that. Yes, I'm talking about the last guy, Obama. Last but not least, payments and housing assistance ends in July with millions expected to be thrown into the streets, again, in the midst of a pandemic. When unemployment was at 4.7% in 2016, 3.7 million people lost their homes in evictions. Our current unemployment number is at 20%. So you can imagine the coming months, what they're going to look like. There are already millions on the streets. Impoverished communities are prone to more illness, absenteeism, school absenteeism, drug abuse, violence, purveyors, and victims of that violence. Poverty has been shown to diminish gray matter in the brains of children, hindering their development. That's assuming they make it to childhood, considering the shockingly high infant mortality rate. I could go through a ton of these stats, but all of it gets to the very basic point that your government accepts this, your population accepts this, and now that your government has all of these crises all at once, it is unresponsive. Is that not weird? Bob, I'm trying to get at this very basic point that we accept a government that basically is inattentive to the needs of the public, and we accept that as, okay, that's just normal. I'm saying that's not normal. That is utterly and entirely fantastically bizarre.
Yeah, it's interesting that word accept. You know, I feel like I would also want to substitute the word for being tricked. I mean, we're tricked into believing in so many ways that the police are these all protectors. I mean, I go back to, as a white person, obviously my experience of what I saw, police officer friendly, the DARE program, having police officers always around. If you ever had an emergency, if you ever got lost, if you ever needed support or help, you just went to the police officer. And it's been done in plain sight. We've normalized the police as the protectors of white people, of the community. But so many white people aren't even in connection or have any relationship with poorer people than them, or when it comes to minority groups. And a deep segregation in the United States, this idea that we're some brilliant, beautiful melting pot, sure, of Euro-Americans. Euro-Americans have melted together pretty well, but when it comes to actually different ethnic diversity, melting pots, those don't exist in the United States. We'll talk later in the show about coronavirus statistics around the percentage of people who actually knew somebody or had somebody in their family that died from the coronavirus. And the numbers are just so jarring between black community members and Latinos, and then compared to white, which is like a huge drop off. Only 4% of American whites actually know somebody within their family who has died of the coronavirus, compared to blacks and Latinos, which was like 12, 13, up to 20% at times. There's a deep segregation that's taking place, and it's a trickery that takes place in this country. To your broader point, Jamal, what's really interesting to me is this kind of broader continued affront to American exceptionalism that's being revealed right now. There was a new study out today from the World Economic Forum's 2019 Global Competitiveness Rankings. In 2018, the U.S. had dropped down the list from third place, basically farther in 2018, and now they've slipped all the way to 10th place. And so on the ranking, Singapore number one, having overtaken the United States a few years ago, the U.S. goes from one now all the way down to 10th. And people are finally understanding that the way in which we orient ourselves around an imperialist framework and then a neoliberal, neoconservative domestic model is not working for the United States, and it's not working with its relations with the rest of the world. So I'm happy to talk about the downfall of American exceptionalism, because people need to wake up to the realities of this country if we're ever going to address it. And people often say, Jamal, or they say to me, Bob, how are you on Russian radio? You're talking about all these bad things. Aren't you just making the divide worse? It's like, no, we actually need to be honest and truthful about what's taking place in this country if we're ever going to address it, because we've been so conditioned to not see it and to not address it. And so finally, there's a reckoning. And I hope this moment provides an opportunity for people to rebel and to grow and create new systems. Otherwise, the whole thing will burn down. We'll see. Time will tell. I'm sure it will go down with the fight, to say the least. Jamal, let's head to our first hour here of Political Misfits. In the first hour, we'll be talking about the latest reports from the CDC showing the shocking impact of the virus on assisted living communities and brown and black people. We'll also be talking about the Donald Trump's executive order on policing, which will come out while we're live on the radio. We'll bring you the latest news as we hear more from that. And Jamal will rip apart an American pastor's effort to rebrand white privilege as a white blessing. Yep, it's that kind of news day, Jamal. If that's not enough for you, Misfits, don't worry. We have a second hour for you after that. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
On Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. Exciting show for you today. Lots to cover. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. Whatever is on your mind, we want to hear from you, 202-521-1320. Big shout out to all of those watching on the Progressive Soapbox, the YouTube channel run by my good friend here, Jamarl Thomas. You can check out Political Misfits daily from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That automatically archives. So if you are not able to check us out live, you can see the show there daily, as well as all the great content Jamarl puts out throughout the week. You can also turn to any podcast platform and find our show as a podcast, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever else you pod your podcast. And if that's not enough, you can always head over to Sputnik News to catch our latest shows, the rest of our colleagues, as well as the great pieces that our writers are putting up there constantly, the latest breaking news for you there daily. We turn our attention now to the West Coast, calling from the East Coast here in D.C. We head to California to talk about the latest coronavirus news from there, as well as the continued protests. To do so, we're joined by Dr. Bill Honigman from the Progressive Democrats of America, National Outreach Lead and Co-Coordinator of the Healthcare as a Human Right Issue Organizing Team for Progressive Democrats of America. Dr. Bill, one heck of a title for one heck of a guy. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Bob and Jamarl. Great to be with you. You guys sound healthy and strong, and that's a very good thing.
Yeah, we're feeling good. We're very thankful that we've been able to continue bringing live shows to our listeners and great guests like yourself. A big shout out to our engineers, Dimitri and Ryan, who handle Political Misfits and continue to keep us on air. Dr. Bill, I wanted to start with your perspective on the protests that are unfolding right now across the country, backing the movement for Black lives. We have talked a lot on this show about the lead up and the different factors that sparked this larger outpouring into the streets. George Floyd's death, caught on tape in the fashion that it was, obviously was the straw that broke the camel's back. But we've also argued that the fallout from the Bernie Sanders campaign being denied the Democratic Party nomination once again, all but alienating young Black voters and Latinos, along with this hoping to see a progressive movement to the left, also played into that calculus. This obviously should be paired with historical trauma in your neck of the woods, especially. I'm thinking here the Watts riots in the 1965 and the brutal beating of Rodney King in 1991 that led to the LA uprisings in 1992. Dr. Bill, share more of your perspective on where your thoughts have been at this moment.
Well, thanks. I'm thinking exactly the same thing, is that, social unrest happens at times of particular stress and strain on kind of the social fabric that we have set up. So, when that fabric has obvious holes in it, then people fall through the holes, fall through the gaps. I had an entire career, recently retired, but 37 years plus working in the emergency room. And I would see people who fell through the cracks. So at a time like this, it's not a surprise to me, especially when we have the incredible strain of this pandemic, something none of us have ever experienced in our lifetimes, only read about from 100 years ago or more. That social unrest is happening as a result. I mean, if you look at the victims of COVID-19, it is largely those underserved populations within the United States, such as the elderly, the infirm, the group house, and especially our communities of color. So you're going to see in the healthcare deserts, both of the inner cities and rural areas, where people have been institutionally underserved because they're not profitable in those areas. Healthcare is not profitable in the inner cities and rural areas. So those people have been underserved, and that's why we're seeing the outbreak, because they're being disproportionately affected by this pandemic, and people are dying. Suffering and dying.
Yeah, I want to hear more on the health impacts. I did want to stay here first on the politics of the moment. It just pains me, as somebody who deeply believes in the intersection of politics, economics, and culture. I'm curious how you're seeing the protests intersect with electoral politics. I just can't imagine, if Bernie Sanders was the Democratic nominee, the lead he would have opened up at this point over Donald Trump. He would be sitting there talking about reparations, around economic redistribution, talking about social unrest, not saying stuff like just shoot them in the legs and not defund the police. I mean, what Joe Biden's doing to himself, he's just doing everything he can to make sure he loses to Donald Trump. I could not imagine how big of a lead Sanders would have if he was the nominee right now. So that completely pains me. I'm curious here, though, what is the move when it comes to these protesters engaging in electoral politics? We had a poll yesterday that showed that the vast majority of people that are planning on voting for Joe Biden right now are voting because they don't want Trump to have a second term, where Donald Trump is turning out people to vote for Donald Trump. I'm curious how that plays out down ballot, right? Because if you're running for Congress, state Senate, state House, dog catcher, you can't simply run, oh, I'm not Donald Trump. People lose the nuance past the presidency, and some people actually pay attention to these down ballot races. So the math doesn't work out the same way as the top of the ticket. Are you seeing any of the electoral candidates in your neck of the woods actually being able to kind of leverage what energy there is out on the streets right now and bring that into the electoral process?
Well, sadly, Bob, not enough of them. I mean, you're not seeing enough champions really step up. I mean, you do have, Bernie Sanders, you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Pramila Jayapal, Ro Khanna. They are champions, and they're stepping up to the challenges of the pandemic and like I said, the social fabric that's been eroded or maybe never existed and needs to be built. But I think, in terms of political kind of an operative or modus operandi, I think in my years involved in the kind of grassroots or popular political groups like PDA, Progressive Democrats America, what I think the way we look at it is very different than the way the establishment politicians look at it, and that's where I think there is hope. I mean, we look at, I think we're looking at achieving a certain threshold, as opposed to that calculation that puts politicians, left of center or right of center, and they think they can pull people over to them. We're looking to build up a movement that gets us over a threshold that actually wins the election. So you're looking at, in this particular case, you're looking at social reforms. In this particular uprising, you're looking at police reforms and reforms in the community that make people safer, including redirecting spending to social services, community projects, job training. You're looking to actually cut those ties with those more corrupting organizations like police unions. So those kind of things are what we're looking at as actually winning campaigns all the way down the ticket. And unfortunately, way too many of our politicians are still trying to play center right, center left, and not thinking of the big picture, the big tent kind of political equation that they need to actually beat Donald Trump. 2016 proved that you can't beat Donald Trump just by saying we need to beat Donald Trump. You have to offer the people something that clearly is better, and that's what building that big movement.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought there was a slight break. Not to be the cynical one here, and the person who's slightly cross. I think Bob went into this conversation because he knew it'd make me cross and it'll dim my light a bit. But is it fair to say that there's nobody to vote for to get what the people want. I mean, early on, if you go into Black Lives Matter policy, I've been screaming about poverty, but truth of the matter is, the defund the police thing very early on is poverty. I mean, they're talking about dealing with it directly because they fully and entirely understand that thriving communities have less cops. Like, so the defund the police thing may be the big draw, but when you get into the details, you really do get into this notion of, look, you have to deal with the cops, but you also need to deal with issues of poverty that kind of drive the cops being there. There's nobody to vote for that. So what happens? I mean, well, one, do you agree with that? And B, what happens to a movement that doesn't necessarily have any redress in the political space?
Terrific question, Jamal. So, again, I'm a healthcare person. That was my career. I spent all my life working with the challenge, especially in healthcare. But if you look at healthcare as an example, and again, I think that's why it's come out in this time of pandemic, we refer to that as the social determinants of health, right? So you're looking at, education, jobs, infrastructure, environmental exposures, all the stressors of living in poverty and with institutional racism. And that's what we're talking about as adversely affecting people that give them the risk, elevate the risk for coming down with COVID-19 and a bad outcome. So which of our politicians, from dog catcher all the way on up, are talking about those kinds of things, or who's running away from it? And that's what you have to look at, community by community, and then get behind those that do. If you have absolutely no one in your community, then you're going to have to look to neighboring communities to support there and, hope that it rubs off on your own. But that's sadly, as you say, where are those champions? Who is standing up for us in this situation?
Yeah, let's expand that conversation here on Political Misfits. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. What you're saying is completely highlighted by these new CDC numbers in regards to the coronavirus. They put out a new report today that looked at the coronavirus between January 22nd and May 30th. So the following numbers are absent the last 2 weeks of data, but between January 22nd, when the first case was confirmed, and the end of May, there was a total of 1.7 million cases and 103,000 related deaths in the country between those dates. Overall, 184,000 people, 14% of patients were hospitalized. 29,000, 2% were admitted to an intensive care unit, and 71,000 had died. Hospitalizations are 6 times higher, and deaths are 12 times higher among those who reported underlying conditions. The most common underlying conditions, and this is what you were getting to, Dr. Bill, were cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and chronic lung disease. And to Jamal's point, the media only covers, terrorist attacks, which kills hardly anybody in the United States every year, but we have millions of cardiovascular, diabetes, and chronic lung disease deaths. Where's the highlighting and conversation around that? And among cases, the study went on to say here, among known race and ethnicity, 33% of cases were Hispanic, 22% were Black, and 1.3% were American, Indian, or Alaska Native. The report notes that these findings suggest that persons in these groups, who account for 18%, 13%, and 0.7% of the U.S. population, respectively, are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Bill, the underlying health issue part of this is key to the broader conversation that I hope we find in the U.S. around preventative health and exercise and what it means to be healthy, which is to your point. And this is Marianne Williamson in all of those Democratic debates. I know people thought she was kooky or wacky. She constantly was talking about how we have a sick care system. We don't have a preventative health care, and let's be healthy. For me, it really boils down to 2 factors. We have an overconsumption problem in the U.S. Shout out to my fine folks in Northern Illinois, specifically overconsumption of sugars and processed foods, but no one talks about this, right? In my hometown of Rockford, Illinois, I think it was like the 3rd or 4th most metropolitan obese part of the country, costing the city millions of dollars in excess healthcare cost every year. If you want to keep costs down, promote being healthy and exercise. And then on the second thing, Dr. Bill, we don't seemingly have ease of access to general healthcare checkups to even get ahead of some of these diseases to help and support people. I'm curious from your perspective, how do we address underlying conditions so viruses, when they do hit a much more resilient community?
It's not an easy fix. But the good news is there are terrific models around the world. We've all heard about places like, South Korea, Denmark, Taiwan, And they are doing it right, or even in Canada, they are doing it right, and that's because they have decided to publicly fund their healthcare system. So, it's interesting if you look at this over time and in perspective. I look back at Hurricane Katrina, and the fact that those lives were somehow expendable. The people who died in New Orleans were expendable. It was not just expendable. This is an extortion model of business practice. So when people die as a result of an environmental catastrophe, a pandemic, or whatever, it puts the message in the survivors' minds that, hey, I have to do more to make sure I end up, okay when the next one hits. And that is the mafia model of business. That's what we have in healthcare. What's your life worth to you, is what, not just big pharma. We're used to them saying that and, overpricing EpiPens and insulin, but also insurance. Corporate health insurance operates under the same model. What's your life worth to you so that you don't end up being one of those victims? Whereas in these countries like South Korea, they have publicly funded healthcare. They could direct their resources to testing, to tracking, to treatment, whatever way that is available. Also, in general healthcare discussions that lead to lowering those risks of all of those conditions that you talked about that in this country at least are so prevalent because we don't have time to sit and have a conversation with our doctor or health educators, about how we can lower those risks. They do that in Canada and Taiwan and Denmark. So that's what we're talking about here is that, this is political will. And it's optimistic on the horizon. More and more people are starting to get that. That's why we need Medicare for all.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I think there's so many things that need to change. First and foremost, obviously, the economics to healthcare, but then just our culture around health promotion and the conversations you're talking about. I did want to just caught myself there between the two different data points. Let me just put the latest total deaths from coronavirus and underlying conditions and symptoms in the United States is 118,000. 118,000 deaths is quite remarkable and shocking. Jamal, I wanted to ask you here about this latest poll from the NORC at the University of Chicago for the Data Foundation. I think a lot about the conversation we had a few weeks ago with Dr. Joseph Richardson from the University of Maryland about compounded trauma on communities, about basically how toxins stay in your system when you basically trigger your flight or fight reaction, and those endorphins basically, and the adrenaline sits and becomes toxic if it's triggered too often. And we're seeing the same type of trauma going to be localized within Black and brown communities in the United States with the coronavirus. This recent study here, though, really highlights it. In the study, they looked at whether or not people knew somebody within their immediate family or friends who had passed away from the coronavirus. In the study, they found 11% of African Americans say they were close with someone who has died from the coronavirus, compared with 5% of Americans overall and 4% of white Americans. The numbers are even starker in several U.S. cities and states. In Louisiana, 16% of Black adults knew somebody compared to 6% of white adults. And among Blacks in Atlanta, 14% had a family member close who had died compared to 4% white. The comparison is 12 to 4% in Baltimore, 15 to 2% in Birmingham, Alabama, and 12 to 4% in Chicago. And in New York, 26% of non-white New Yorkers say a family member or close friend has died from the coronavirus, compared with just 10% of white adults in New York City. Jamal, Blacks and people of color in this country are not only carrying the brunt of the physical damages of coronavirus, but they're also going to carry the mental and psychological damages as well.
Those numbers are appalling. I mean, honestly, this was something that we knew was coming. We had months. And these guys basically raided the Treasury while people died. I would wager to you, if these were millionaires dying like this, these numbers wouldn't be this appalling. I mean, that's horrendous. And Ilhan Omar's dad died last night.
Yeah, geez.
It's I think part and parcel to the problem is that African Americans, the heart disease, diabetes, these type of diseases, some of which are brought by income inequalities. Teeth and cavities show a link to heart disease. So kids, early age, not getting dinner with work, could basically be creating their heart condition later on in life. And to your other point, Bob, making the point that, these kids, the fight and flight hormone, well, that stuff soaks into you. I mean, part of the reason why they say angomaniacs die of heart disease is because that fight and flight hormone is basically soaking into your system constantly over the course of a day. Dr. Honigman, when you look at this and when you see these numbers, I mean, these numbers are stark. And I mean, there's somewhat of an indictment in a society that doesn't necessarily seem to care about the various members of that society. How does, and I guess this kind of goes to my point of what does a political system do when there is no capacity for that political system to deal with the actual issues that your public and group are angered by? And does that sour? I mean, if these numbers get worse, which they may get worse as they open the economy, especially since the people who are going to be on the front lines in those jobs are people of color, I can only expect that 3-to-1 number go up. The people who are already on the streets, you already have millions screaming Black Lives Matter. How difficult is it to kind of make that conversation or that switch over to Black Lives Matter in the context of healthcare also? And do you think something like that will take place in regards to if this perpetuates itself?
Oh, absolutely. So if we look at whether or not the political system cares, actually they do. And I tend to look at it with science in my background as what we call a host-parasite relationship. And we have clearly now parasites in our system, in our political system, that gain personal profit off of victimizing certain groups in society. And that's why it's coming out in the form of social unrest. So how do we, as the hosts of those parasites, eliminate those parasites? It's the political process. So if you look at COVID-19 in particular, some areas in this country and certainly other countries around the world have managed to flatten that curve, right? With all of the specific public health measures, this country overall is doing a lousy job because, as we know, there was a directed effort at certain individuals profiting off of the situation and the shock doctrine type thing, and we flattened the curve in some areas, but we haven't eliminated the curve. And we're expecting a second wave at any time, although some people are saying we're having a second peak of the first wave. But we can fully expect this to continue on. And how can we, especially be prepared for that? Well, more and more of us need to step up and demand of our elected officials, and that is all the way from, dog catcher on up. All of our elected officials need to demand that we pull out the parasite out of the system. Who is making profit, in these public-private partnerships? Privatization equals profitization. So we need to eliminate that part of the equation and make it public. This is a public health emergency, demands a public response to it. The public needs to be in charge of this, not corporate America. And how do we do that? We call our members of Congress. We support those bills in Congress that look like they're directed at us, like the ones from Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal. We demand that our cities and school districts and counties put forward and support resolutions for Medicare for all. And a lot of us who are going to this Democratic convention in whatever shape it takes, we're demanding that Medicare for all be in the platform of the Democratic Party. We know the Republican Party is 100% against it, but there are Democrats who are in favor of it, and we're going to that convention demanding that in the platform for Medicare for all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We appreciate you heading that way. We just have a few minutes left here with Dr. Bill Honigman, the Progressive Democrats of America National Outreach Lead and co-coordinator of the Healthcare as a Human Right issue organizing team. Donald Trump is talking right now about his policing executive order, so we'll get to that right after the break. I did want to play a latest poll guessing game, Dr. Bill, here on Political Misfits. We always like to test out Jamarl's ability to read the minds of the American people. We'll invite you to play as well. We have a new poll out from the NORC at the University of Chicago. You may have to disqualify yourself if you've already seen the results, though. Looking at the happiness levels of the American people in the midst of coronavirus and these major protests. The two questions I have here: what percent of Americans said they feel very happy, and what percentage of Americans feel they said they felt isolated in recent weeks? I'll start here with the first question. Jamarl Thomas, what percent of American adults say they are very happy?
Maybe 24%. Very happy is a high bar. Oh, you know what? Very happy is a high bar. I'm going to say 19%.
All right. You got to re-guess there, Dr. Bill. You can give one or two answers. How are you feeling? What percentage of Americans say they are very happy?
Well, I'm going for a tenth of Jamarl's answer, so I'd say about 2 or 3%.
All right. You guys actually fall right in between 14%.
Oh,
that number's
closer.
down. That number is down from 31% who said the same just 2 years ago in 2018.
Are you serious?
Let me also ask you here the second one. We'll start with you, Dr. Bill. What percent of Americans said they felt isolated in recent weeks?
I'm going for nice round number, 88%.
All right. Jamarl Thomas.
I'm going to say that some people have family. And because of that, I'm going to take that number down to 65%.
All right, 50%. The number is 50%. So you guys both overshot just by a bit there. The number was 23% at the same time in 2018. The study went on to also look at what percent of people said they lacked companionship. That's 45%. And what percent of people felt left out in the past 4 weeks of an event or a friend's gathering. That was 37%. I thought what was interesting here, Dr. Bill, and just give you the last word here before we turn to a break. In the survey, they said they also conducted similar surveys after the death of President John F. Kennedy following his assassination in 1963. And after the September 11th terror attacks, Americans are less likely to report some type of emotional or psychological stress reactions following COVID-19 outbreak. So Americans said they felt more stress and emotional reaction from 9/11 and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And fewer Americans reported that they felt the need to smoke more than usual, cry, or feel dazed more than they had because of those previous two tragedies. So I'm interested in kind of this moment where it's kind of this thing where it's like everything feels normal, but everything is completely off. And it's not like just one pivotal like death of a president or 9/11 kind of shock to the system, but with unhappiness skyrocketing, less people being happy. It's not necessarily like a specific moment, but it's just the broader political and social environment, economic environment too, that we live within.
Yeah, my reaction to that would be that as a healthcare professional provider, I find that terrific news that people are taking to heart the advisement to get enough rest, exercise, eat well. Those are extremely important things to do in this time of an extreme healthcare challenge. But you also have, by contrast, you have those disproportionately affected populations, and we all see that. And it brings to mind things like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, that we had a welfare for the well-off and rugged individualism for the working class. So there's no way that people can ignore that reality, and that is pouring out in the streets, and it deserves to be. So I think it's a dichotomy, but it's a good one. It's one that's going to bring about positive social change in the end.
Yeah, it's quite. I mean, I just think about any time people berate or belittle people for not turning out to vote, and you're saying the system is disproportionately killing them, affecting them psychologically, economically, all of these things, and yet you want people to continue to participate in these systems, and people are not going to go vote. They're going to continue to take to the streets. So it's great to see that people are finally being heard and recognized for the pains they're living with, and they're continuing to go out there in the streets, which is not an easy thing to do. So it shows quite a bit of bravery. With that, though, we are out of time with Dr. Bill Hahnemann of Progressive Democrats of America. Dr. Bill, where can people find more of you and your work online?
Thanks again for having me. It's pdamerica.org. That's Progressive Democrats America, pdamerica.org.
After the break, we're jumping in live to Donald Trump's speech at the Rose Garden on his latest executive order. We'll give you the latest updates here on Political Misfits. You're listening to Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. We don't give you any of that. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with Bob Schlehuber. If you guys are just joining us, we've been discussing the CDC COVID-19 demographic breakdown and the intersection between health care movements and the larger movements taking place in the streets. If you all are digging what we're putting down, and only if you're digging what we're putting down, give us a like, give us a share, and of course subscribe. We are growing this channel, and your engagement makes that possible. If you guys want to get in on the conversation, you can give us a chat, tweet, or a call at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Teamwork makes the dream work. You guys can't see how hard Bob Schlehuber is working here in the virtual, but he is doing a magnificent job. Now, Donald Trump has just finished up one of his speeches on the executive order that he was going to give for basically dealing in some way with the police. He's trying to show that he acknowledges this loud crowd, millions of human beings, I guess they're hard to ignore, and he is trying to do something, I suppose, to appease this crowd, but coming from Donald Trump. It is unclear what that was going to be. Mr. Trump's executive order is shaped by four key components. 1, incentivize police department agencies to adopt best practices for use on force. Oh, wow. Share officer misconduct. Oh, wow. Co-responder program for nonviolent calls. Ban chokeholds unless the officer's life is at risk.
Did it. It's done. Solved it. Over.
Yeah, I'll finish it. I mean, but that's horrendous. That's nothing. That's nothing. That's less than nothing. I'll tell you this. Ban chokeholds, they have guns, batons. They killed that guy with a taser the other day with gas or tear gas. It's more than just chokeholds. And I hate to point out that Pantaleo was using an illegal chokehold. Was his life at risk? No. But was he going to scream, my life was there? Oh, he's so black. I was terrified. I had to choke him to death. Like, I mean, come on. And then this other one, we're going to have him play with more kittens. As if that is going to somehow solve.
But Jamal, isn't this better than saying, we're just going to have our officers, instead of shooting people in the head, we'll just have them shoot them in the leg?
In a way,
I mean, that's what's so absurd, is the bar running against Joe Biden is so incredibly low, because these do feel fine for the broader American populace, the broader American white people, the owner class, those who own property class, right? Best practices always sounds good. Officer misconduct, transparency always sounds good. Co-responder program for nonviolent calls. It's basically what a lot of people that are actually on the left calling for defunding of the police may not want the police to be there as well. But here, when you actually have a nonviolent emergency and you need, say, a medical professional, the police will come anyway. So that's already kind of happening. Exactly. But that sounds good on paper. And ban holds, I mean, the chokehold one here is pretty pretty ridiculous because it does say unless an officer's life is at risk, and we've seen officers basically say once they put on that uniform, their life is at risk. So
Always.
that doesn't really
Always at risk.
chokehold. But again, at least he addresses it, and sure, he's like skirts it. But again, compared to Joe Biden, basically saying, I care about black people, I care about young people, I care about Sanders voters, and then basically saying, shoot him in the leg, and I don't support defunding the police. What does that do for his political electoral chances? Where Donald Trump puts out this, which obviously we can pick apart and completely discredit it, but for his base and for the kind of the conservative Republicans out there, this is a huge win. He's playing politics much better than Joe Biden.
You know, Mindy made a really good choice in putting us together. I think I'm being radicalized on this stuff. When I was younger, I was heavy into the pro-black thing. My dad used to joke talking about you're going to get a bean pie. And somewhere along the way, I got unmoored from that. And I think I remember when, basically during the medical illness, one of the doctors came out, the guy was white. I realized, well, clearly it's not everybody. And, you know, but you see this and it's like, he's not even being serious. And the catch becomes, what does white America do? Does white America, who has been out there protesting with blacks, look at this and say, fair enough, that's good, and walk? Like, Black Lives Matter is not going to stop protesting, seeing this, because they're going to see it for what it is. Basically just, you know, a shiny object that doesn't necessarily is performative, theatrical. So yeah, Donald Trump's base, Republicans are going to say, hey, he dealt with that police issue. He didn't do anything.
I don't know if it's even his base, because obviously his base wants like quadruple the police and militarize all of the streets, or at least enhance the protections for militias. But I think this for kind of the centrist, the people that kind of are like half in politics, are kind of starting to pay attention a little bit. I think it pushes back just enough for them to simply kind of go, all right, I'm going to go back to sleep.
Yeah,
at least the guy, because Donald Trump didn't have to come out and do anything. He didn't need to come out and say any of this stuff, which would have basically perpetuated the problem for him. But I think for him to come out and talk about these things, because a lot of the stuff sounds like community policing sounds great. Officer friendly sounds great. Walk the streets, get to know your neighborhood sounds great. There's no study that actually backs up and says that actually decreases violent crime. Exactly. If anything, it builds trust between the police and the community. It may help a detective or two get a better lead in actually solving a crime, but it's not actually a preventative measure. But a lot of people aren't into the weeds with policing because you're either been brutalized by them and you're already out of the political system because you're poor at that point or a person of color, or the police have basically been fine with you in your life outside of a traffic ticket or two when your house is broken into, or if somebody's bird watching in New York Central Park and you need to call the police on them, the police will respond and basically take your side regardless of the situation. So I don't think Donald Trump needed to do that much to be able to do enough. And I guess that's a sick state of affairs of where the American system is, that it's obviously much beyond Donald Trump. But in this situation, I think he just took the smallest step he needed, and that's going to appease a lot of people. And that, like, I think what you're saying is quite tragic.
It really is. I mean, because I think Donald Trump had to respond. Because I think when polling was looking at it, it was like, he's handling this issue poorly. I think for him, he was like, well, I got to do something, even if it's performative. I got to do something. I got to give people some argument where they can say, well, Trump did this. And those people go back to sleep, like you say, not necessarily entirely engaged in politics, may trend somewhat to the right, especially on issues of crime and justice, and look at the cops as being a good force, missing the point that cops are just there to keep order, whether that's the apartheid, whether that's Jim Crow, whether that's some Nazi system of government. They're just there for order. It's not good, bad, justice, or anything else. They could be there for justice. Oftentimes, they're just not. And so,
and I mean, it just speaks epitomes of white blessings here in the United States, of the ability for white people not to actually have to deal with these issues. Jamal Thomas, can you please tell this white blessing story? It's too much to leave out here.
The white blessings thing is awesome. So, with Black Lives Matter taking up a large visual and organizing presence in the protests across the United States, arguably the world, race is invariably at the center of the conversation. There are a lot of blacks out there, and you don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to raise your hand. I know that you don't have to raise your hand to say whether or not you've had a white friend call you up to have the conversation. Now, oftentimes, we don't want to have this conversation. Oftentimes, people like my wife are perfectly okay with having these fulfilling, shallow friendships, with not necessarily looking under the cover, because you just may be some monsters there that you don't necessarily want to hear about that may screw up your friendship. That said, society basically is just the culmination of individual expression. So invariably, someone, somewhere, was going to get the idea to find participants to give breath and life to a template version of the solemn conversation and put it on stage for the world to observe. On June 14th, starring in the role of General White Person Number 1, we have everyman, megachurch pastor Louis Giglio, I like to call him Gigolo. Starring as White Person Number 2, we have the infamous Chick-fil-A CEO Dan Cathy, famous for giving people a way to show just how little they think of gay community for the affordable price of a chicken sandwich. Playing the role of the patient black friend, we have rapper Lucretia. Now, you're the person you're going to hear speaking, or the person you're going to hear speaking is General White Person Number 1, as represented by megachurch pastor Louis Giglio. Now, Pastor Giglio is not feeling the term white privilege, and he thinks he has a better idea for the phrase. Let's hear the clip.
We understand the curse that was slavery, white people do, and we say that was bad, but we miss the blessing of slavery, that it actually built up the framework for the world that white people live in and lived in. And so a lot of people call this white privilege, and when you say those two words, it just is like a fuse goes off for a lot of white people, because they don't want somebody telling them to check their privilege. And so I know that you and I both have struggled in these days with, hey, if the phrase is the trip up, let's get over the phrase and let's get down to the heart.
Sure.
Let's get down to what then do you want to call it? And I think maybe a great thing for me is to call it white blessing, that I'm living in the blessing of the curse that happened generationally that allowed me to grow up in Atlanta.
I like that. The brutal mangling of a race into a commodity, holding up the world like Atlas. That's what he likes. I love that. I love that. Why are people throwing statues in the river? Whether or not you think it's right or wrong, engage that point for the moment. Engage the rationale. Indian murderer Andrew Jackson was celebrated on the $20 bill. Now, I pass Confederate statues nearly every day living in Richmond, Virginia. A gang of fascistic terrorists that tried to topple the U.S. government for the freedom to deprive another of their freedom. White blessing is the linguistic version of the rationale for creating those statues in the first place, with a special dollop of white fragility. Whether you realize it or not, it wasn't a blessing for everyone, especially the person who you are talking to, who you're trying to convince that white blessing should be used as opposed to white privilege. The notion that you're going to call something a blessing that brutally subjugated a species, a race, and by the way, something that we are still dealing with today, the outcomes we're still dealing with today, and you're calling this stuff a white blessing. That's not a blessing for everybody, buddy. And there's a certain degree of privilege that's even built into having that conversation, of having the stones to stand and look another man in the eye and say something like that, especially the person who was at the bad end of that quote unquote of that white blessing. Bob, explain what this man is talking about.
No, I'm gonna pass on that. There's pass. You know, it's funny. Not fun. This is, again, it's like not funny because this stuff is tragic and it's disgusting. Kind of like what you said. It's not a blessing. It's quite horrific. I mean, this was like hearing, you know, Alan Wolfowitz and other generals that went in and invaded Iraq, and they were like, you know, I just had the greatest and coolest opportunity to go in and rebuild a country, to rebuild a nation. It's like the coolest and like greatest opportunity to basically destroy hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million people's lives, where you destroyed their land, killed them. So it's much higher than 1 million people that didn't die that have to still live in post-invaded Iraq by the United States, talking about how cool and lucky it was to go work within those settings. Yeah, I just, again, there's just a subset of white people in this country, and sure, the small percentage of black people and people of color within there, who just will never get it. It's just never going to fully hit them how radical slavery was of an idea and how horrific it continues to haunt the American people. Jamal, with that, we do need to move to a second break before we head to our second hour of news, politics, and culture. In our second hour, we are joined by show favorite Alan McLeod to talk about the Democratic Party's inability to move to the political left, the U.S. tearing up a decades-old weapons of mass destruction treaty so it can sell drones to Saudi Arabia, And later in the show, in our Politics of Art segment, we look at Dave Chappelle's latest stand-up special addressing the death of George Floyd. You listen to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my disembodied co-host, floating head, Bob Schlehuber. We have a lot still to cover over the hour, including what will likely be an exceptional Politics of Art segment where we'll cover David Chapelle, latest special comment on the George Floyd murder. As always, you can join into the conversation with chats, tweets, or calls at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Also, if you are digging what we are putting down, definitely give up the like and share this content. We are growing, and your engagement makes that possible. The world erupts. Now, despite the appalling stat of cops killing more than 1,000 people a year, made more abominable by 99% resulting in no charges, the murder of George Floyd reached into the conscience of the nation with significant shifts in public opinion on police brutality, bias, and the justice system, even on the question of whether racism is a significant problem in the United States. That number, by the way, even spiked for blacks. What would a rational society do? Millions of white, black, and everything in between have found their intersectional moment and have flooded the streets, complete with masks, with some extra special overachievers, even rocking gloves. The phrase that caught fire, defund the police departments, and use that moment or that money for social services that will organically lower crime and lower the number of adverse interactions human beings are having with cops, particularly in this very specific case, African Americans. Trump signed an executive order on policing at noon. Biden hears the roar of the crowd, and reporting has him leaning towards Kamala Harris, basically doubling down. I hear that you want to defund the police, but we need to have a tough on crime ticket. I'd call it astonishing if I wasn't paying attention up to now. This is a bit of performative politics, the ultimate act of affirmative action, done to appease identitarians without getting anything real in return for that appeasing. As if Obama's black skin stopped Eric Garner from being murdered by an illegal chokehold, or for that matter, him funneling 90% of the income gains to the top 1%, or for that matter, allowing people to drink lead water without really caring about it, or for that matter, letting Native Americans get killed at Sandy Rock. There's a lot of those for that matter. But yeah, the movement, what we need at this moment is a black cop that giggled at the thought of terrorizing a homeless mother that was working 2 jobs for truancy violations. That's entirely, totally what we need. To discuss, we're joined by Alan McLeod, author, journalist, media analyst, and member of the Glasgow University Media Group. Alan, welcome to the show. How are you today?
What's going on, guys? I'm doing well.
Thank you for joining us. So we've been asking all of our guests this question because we try to get an idea on how people of the various disciplines are viewing and perceiving the events that are taking place around the world, specifically with a focus in the United States. So how have you been viewing these protests from your point of view?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you summed up quite well. I think it's extraordinary how just a couple of minutes of footage has managed to unite tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans in outrage and inspire them really to come together to try to change a system that has been in place for decades, if not centuries. And it really is astonishing right now that the Democrats are not really even not really even rhetorically offering them anything. I think it's we're living in very interesting times, let's say the least.
So I want to jump to the issue of North Korea for the moment. Last night, I was up. I don't sleep all that well. And I see that North Korea is trending. And inquiring into the story, I see that apparently Kim Jong-un, leader of the People's Republic of North Korea, basically blew to bits the liaison center, which is basically a peaceful communication hub between South Korea and itself. Can you explain what exactly is going on in North Korea? I mean, after all, this was supposed to be a relationship that seemed to be budding into something that was legit. And also, on top of that, what is the level of anger? I mean, it's symbolic to blow up the communication or the liaison center, but is that theatrical, or is there a real deep seething anger associated with it that's representative by what they've done?
Well, it's very difficult to really judge what's going on in North Korea. You know, it's famously a state which does not have a lot of international penetration. But yeah, certainly in the last few, maybe decade or so, we've seen gradual steps towards an integration between North and South, which in the long run is really where the country's future is. I mean, for centuries, it was really one kingdom, one country, and it's only been in this lifetime where the two have split apart, and that's primarily due to international interference, isn't it? I mean, in the 1950s, the United States, the Soviet Union, China all got involved on the peninsula. But yeah, in the last 10 years or so, there have been a few gradual steps towards reunification. We saw, for instance, at the Olympics, there was an ice hockey team that flew under the unified flag. We've seen more dialogue between the two, and so now this incident that happened yesterday is a very worrying incident, excuse me, where the North appears to have been goaded, or for whatever reason has decided to respond strongly to the sort of build-up of military units and stuff on the border. And this, I think we have to also look at the role of the United States in this as well, because the U.S. has been plying the South with arms. There's tens of thousands of units there. Obama, of course, initially started this pivot to Asia. And so we saw a situation where there is an increasing tension between the two, and this might be just one little incident that triggers something bigger.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of little incidences that could trigger something bigger here, Alan, is reports coming from northern India, clashes between Indian soldiers and Chinese troops. It's being reported by NDTV here that there was 20 Indian soldiers killed and more than 43 Chinese soldiers have been killed or seriously injured. So in a place where we always kind of focus on the U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia and in Asia in general here, it seems like China now, with what's taking place there in North Korea as well as in India, are also having to play a little bit more foreign policy and think more about potential conflict, which is quite alarming to say the least.
Alarming is definitely the word. You know, that Himalayan region has been the site of greatly increased conflict over the last few years. Last year we saw the Modi government essentially invade Kashmir, which was a very delicate region. Even before then, India and Pakistan have gone to war before over parts of the region. And so we really are facing a situation, if India and China are going to start opening hostilities, that entire Himalayan region may blow up at any point.
Wow. Yeah, and Jamal Thomas, I mean, in a time and place in the world where, again, we're needing to demand that there's more collaboration between global superpowers, we're seeing the superpowers continue to fight over resources, and we're seeing that the world, as it continues to turn back on, is going to ramp up all of the military games, all of the U.S. imperialism will ramp back up. The coronavirus maybe slowed things down there for a second, but that kind of global posturing, it's absolutely devastating to see that the world is still not able to find broader peace between some of these different regional actors. And just back to the North Korea point, South Korea being blamed for having sent and dropping propaganda flyers into the country has really irritated North Korea. And it also shows in many ways, and it's just ridiculous listening to Bob Gates yesterday saying, you know what, Donald Trump actually did quite a good job there confronting China and actually reaching out to the North Koreans like others did not. But at the same time, reaching out to North Korea, starting that process, and then basically just dropping the ball and saying, I'm going to go back home, will actually cause just as much damage. That the United States is not playing peacemaker around the world. Donald Trump was going there for photo ops and to basically kind of get shallow wins. And now we're still at a destabilized place. Again, quite terrifying.
Yeah, it is. I mean, when Donald Trump stood on the demilitarized zone and everybody kind of applauded him, like you say, he just dropped the ball. He was like, all right, I'm done with that. And as if that process was going to magically take hold. Alan, I'm curious, piggybacking on that point, international politics, dealing with this notion of countries not necessarily being the best of neighbors, a weapons treaty that has been in place. Donald Trump, when John Bolton got in office, with Donald Trump, was working with Donald Trump, it was understood that John Bolton was against pretty much all treaties. His thought is, if we're at an apex position, then it only diminishes us to basically allow a treaty. Now, if you're looking at the world from the lens of we're going to be king of the world, then that makes all the sense in the world. If you're looking at trying to be neighbors, not so much. Can you explain the treaty that they've just pulled out of? This treaty was in place for decades.
Yeah, sure. So it's a treaty signed by Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 80s. It's 33 years old. It's called the Missile Technology Control Regime Treaty. And it was basically an agreement between most of the developed countries in the world, including the Soviet Union, the United States, Japan, most of the European countries, which was regulating the control, supply, and production of cruise missiles. And later it became for drones as well. Well, what's happened is the Trump administration has decided to unilaterally back out of that treaty. The reason they want to do that is because they want to increase sales of Predator drones to countries, specifically Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and most of the Middle Eastern states, which they want to supply with weapons. Now, the White House is saying that this will help Saudi Arabia fight terrorism, and it will keep any conflicts in the Middle East and keep the U.S. safer. But you really have to laugh at that when you look at what Saudi Arabia right now is doing in Yemen, which is completely destroying the country, creating a humanitarian crisis. And of course, Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest state sponsors of terrorism, exporting its extremist ideology across the Middle East. So the idea that these drones are going to be used in a peaceful manner is pretty laughable. And also the potential consequences for the rest of the world seeing this, for China, for Russia, for any other country seeing this and thinking, well, this treaty is now completely broken. Why should I compel to it? That's the problem, because the Trump administration has been pulling out of a number of treaties. I mean, the Open Skies Treaty is pretty much dead because Trump decided the U.S. wasn't going to abide by it. We've seen the New START Treaty. That looks like it's going to be dead in the water come February 2021. So there's a number of very worrying events which have led experts to really start panicking over the level of a potential nuclear buildup again, the sort of thing we saw in the 50s and 60s. I think we certainly don't want to go back to that kind of level of suspicion, mistrust.
Exactly. But explain why. Be very specific. Why were those treaties put into place? Meaning, what function were those treaties solving? Because it goes beyond just the nuclear buildup, right? It also goes into the amount of time that each country has to assess what's taking place and be able to respond to it, and to ensure that there are no false missiles, meaning they think they're under attack. They find out they're not under attack, but they've already sent the missiles over because the window of time frame of response is so narrow.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, just to take the Open Skies Treaty for an example, what that treaty means is that any country can fly over another country's airspace with reconnaissance planes. so they can take photos, they can surveil what's going on at other countries' military bases. And the point of this is to have a much more open dialogue about the capabilities of other countries. And so there's just a lot more information in the system, so people are not a bit more paranoid. People actually know what's going on. And when I say people, I mean people in the know, military generals. And that the point of these things is to try to alleviate exactly what you said, where countries mistakenly believe they're under attack, and so they fire the missiles. This has happened multiple times in the past. It happened to the United States and the Soviet Union, where both countries thought they were under terminal nuclear attack, and both times they decided not to fire the missiles in response. Now, that could have gone an entirely different way, and if it did, we wouldn't be speaking with each other right now. In fact, there would be barely any humans alive on the Earth right now. And so these treaties, even though they may seem kind of obscure to a lot of people, these are really fundamental to the continued existence of human beings on this planet. And so really we should be talking about this, should be front page news.
Yeah, and it's quite terrifying. I'm sorry, so my word today is terrifying. But it is quite concerning here that Donald Trump is not a historian. He's not somebody that studied constitutional law or has a background in political science. He has no interest in understanding why these treaties were written in the first place or understanding how difficult they'll be to get back in. He's just looking to score points when it comes to either financial points or this idea that America first, we don't have any treaties, we set the tone and others will follow us if they want or not. Alan, I'm curious kind of the long-term damage he's doing, because, again, it's not like you just re-enter into these treaties. It obviously is going to make it harder for any future president to sign treaties, because here's America once again breaking their promise. But I'm also really get concerned when it comes to what other people within the Department of Defense at the Pentagon are able to do once Donald Trump is basically unworked some of these, right? So Donald Trump wants to make a bunch of money and show the economy is strong and sell weapons to Saudi Arabia and break these treaties, but he doesn't actually see then what the Department of Defense and the Pentagon is then going to do to leverage the continued aggression by the U.S. imperialists. I'm curious, how do you think the generals will respond to this? And they seem like they're just loving it right now.
Yeah, some generals certainly love it, but we've even seen some people within the military establishment balk at this, understanding that this is making the country, the region, and the entire world a lot less safe. There was an extraordinary article in Foreign Affairs, which is this very obscure foreign policy journal, which is only read by the elite. And the ex-Deputy Secretary General of NATO, an American, was just in absolute despair at what Trump was doing, saying that this was one of the most dangerous, lunatic things that she'd ever seen. Things got so bad that she actually presented Vladimir Putin as a man of peace and one of the adults in the room. And that really doesn't happen very often by NATO top brass, does it? And so really, I think what we're seeing is the destruction of decades of not really, frankly, good enough work, but some sort of patchwork of trying to reduce the risk of one of the major threats to organized human survival on the planet, which is nuclear weapons. And we're seeing it ripped up in just a few months. And why is he doing this? Because absolute ghouls like John Bolton have got his ear, and he wants to make, the stocks of a few defense contractors go up. When you actually start thinking about it, there's nothing else to do but laugh or cry, frankly.
Yeah, laugh or cry, one or the other. Both are somewhat appropriate in odd ways. Let's get to some domestic politics. Right now, I kind of mentioned before that Donald Trump basically has come out with his executive order that gives cops more kittens and puppies to make them more cuddlier, and hopefully to get that number down from 1,000 to 800. But basically, ineffectual nonsense. But the catch is, Joe Biden has taken a different tact on this. He's doing a little bit more performative work, and his focus is less on dealing with an issue and more seeming to be done with identitarian politics. Meaning, I'm just going to get a black woman for this job. Missing the point that the black woman used to be a cop. That all sorts of horrible videos about her either laughing about locking up stoners, laughing about putting people in prison. There is a horrendous video of Kamala Harris laughing about locking and harassing, like outright terrorizing, a homeless mother who had 2 kids who was having difficulty keeping those kids in school because A, she was homeless, and B, she was working 2 jobs. I don't think that's a funny issue. But this is the person that Joe Biden is putting up. Is this going to be accepted? Meaning, is Black Lives Matter going to look at Kamala Harris and say, okay, fair enough, you meet our qualifications? Or is he looking at Black Lives Matter as a small percentage of the population? And I would get the black vote, who basically have been broken in regards to the way they do politics by the Democratic Party, to think of this stuff in almost entirely in identitarian terms.
Well, I mean, this should be one of the biggest layups in U.S. political history. And maybe just a calamitous response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has seen, over 117,000 Americans officially die, and handling of the George Floyd protests, which the large majority, when polled, seem to be strongly against Donald Trump's handling, and strongly sympathetic towards Black Lives Matter. Biden has really offered very little in the way of criticism. I mean, famously, he said, one of his only things he's, offered about the police is to shoot them in the leg rather than in the torso. In terms of picking Harris, well, if you ask me if Black Lives Matter is going to accept this, I think judging by how politically aware and historically intelligent, they're certainly not going to just see a black face in high office and think, well, this is great. Because, of course, Black Lives Matter developed under Obama. It was started when Obama was president. You had racist policing then. And I don't think putting another blackface in the vice president in the Oval Office is going to do anything, really, frankly, for racial relations in the U.S. So I don't think Black Lives Matter is going to really accept this. The question is whether the public is going to look at what Trump is offering and look at what Biden is offering and judge whether Biden is worth voting for. I think that's a really open question right now.
I do think it ends up being. I do think it's going to end up being Warren. I just think that it's going to be. They're going to have to swallow it, and I just think the other candidates that are running because Donald. You talk about a political layup, Alan, and it's just like pick somebody. I don't know. It's like pick somebody safe. Don't mess it up, and they're going to mess it up. For me, at this point, Jamal, I do think Warren is still the safe pick. I know people want a person other, but maybe he'll announce like the Secretary of State or Defense, or weirdly come out with a cabinet pick, or basically say if I have to nominate a justice, somebody to the Supreme Court of the United States, that he comes out and names that. But in the sense that it's going to have to be a transitional person, he's already talked about like a one-term presidency and handing it to the next person, Jamal. Yeah. I just think somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who has that national attention, and as much as I know it's going to make you fume, Elizabeth Warren did do some very significant outreach into the Black Lives Matter community. She was holding those national roundtables. She got a lot of press and attention for that. A lot of people in the Black Lives Matter DC community here also had the opportunity to meet with her, and they felt heard. That, again, it might actually play into their benefit to pick the safer pick to somebody who's actually done a lot of that legwork. It's going to make people irate to think that she somehow has those relationships, but I think she's earned that, and I think if they poll it, I think Warren's going to still end up being the best pick.
I think she's earned it, but I think she's earned it for an entirely different reason. Basically putting the kneecaps.
Oh, yeah.
Right, blowing out
what else does she get? I mean, what else does she get for doing what she did to Bernie Sanders? I mean, remarkable. She more than James Clyburn, I think, really swung it for Biden, for her not speaking out like she did for Sanders. If she would have endorsed Sanders, I think that would have been the thing that would have carried him past South Carolina, despite what Clyburn did, and allowed him to regain some of that foothold. For her to stay in, to not endorse Sanders like she did, she has to get something out of it. I think it's the VP.
I mean, I feel you on that. I mean, keep in mind, my two picks were Warren or Kamala Harris. It boiled down to whether or not Joe Biden believes I need to appease the black vote or the lefties. And that's kind of like, I lean more towards the black vote just because of the time that we're in.
But does Harris get him any more of the black vote than Barack Obama does?
No, and
that's what I don't
catch,
get.
Right? That's the catch. It's performative. I mean, he's going to get 93% of the black vote regardless of what he does. And so it's like, if you're choosing her more so to say thank you more than anything you're getting out of it, right? Or just to take advantage of the moment. I mean, I'm Alan, I'm sorry. What do you think about what we're saying? Meaning, how do you view this? Like, do you take Bob's point that basically it's like, no, he needs the lefty vote, and basically he's going to get the black vote regardless, so he's going to choose Warren. Where do you come down in regards to the Veep stakes?
I got to tell you, if Biden really wanted to shore up that left vote, there's an obvious candidate he should pick for vice president, and that's Bernie Sanders. But I think nobody is even discussing that as a possibility shows that it shows that where the Democratic Party really is. In terms of Warren, I've noticed on the bookmakers, they basically put her chances at about 9 or 10%, whereas Kamala Harris is the odds-on favorite right now.
Interesting.
Listen, I don't think Biden has spent a lot of time trying to court the left, frankly. His entire career has been opposing the progressive wing. He's been trying to shoot it down. The very first thing he said on his campaign, the first stop he did, he said, nothing will fundamentally change if I'm president. And I think that's really the key message with Biden. It's, do you want to go back, turn the clock back a few years, or do you want to keep on this wild roller coaster with Trump?
Jamal, I will say, just the Trump comms team and their ad makers have just been eating apart Joe Biden.
Yes.
And after what Kamala Harris said about I was that little girl on the bus,
right?
What is he going to say?
Right.
Joe Biden finally ends segregation, ride the bus with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden for the ticket. I mean, they're just going to eat this apart, and that's going to live there forever. We just have a few minutes left here on Political Misfits with Alan McLeod, author, journalist, media analyst. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. Alan, I did want to just pivot, another hard pivot here as we jump around on Political Misfits. Not all of our stories always fit together, but we're here to cover all of the news, politics, and culture of the day. I wanted just a little bit of your personal experience here with Mint Press being blacklisted by Wikipedia. We reported the other day, I think last Friday, about our good friends over at the Gray Zone having their personal accounts not even be their personal profiles not being listed on Wikipedia, despite other just ridiculous journalists actually making the cut to have a Wikipedia page, and then also having their Wikipedia page of Gray Zone not allow external links to the site. It seems like similar things are happening to you and other colleagues there at Mint Press.
Yeah, you heard about that. This is happening to a number of alternative media outlets, which have, in the last few years, really come under attack. What's happened is since the 2016 election and the Hillary Clinton campaign deciding that fake news, particularly Russian fake news, cost her the election, we have seen an enormous bite back from corporate media and from big social media companies dedicated to supposedly trying to filter out bad quality information and promote good quality information. But the upshot of that is that the big media companies have changed their algorithms to promote establishment legacy outlets like CNN or Fox or MSNBC, and high-quality alternative websites have seen their traffic just crash. Sites like Democracy Now!, The Intercept, Mint Press, Common Dreams, etc. have all seen their Google traffic just crater, and that's because they've been deranked, delisted, demoted, etc. In terms of Wikipedia, Mint Press, the Gray Zone and Venezuela analysis have been subject to a very sort of niche boycott, basically, by a bunch of very active, very online right-wing Venezuelans who pretty much control the Venezuelan Wikipedia world, and they have managed to force through some kind of blacklisting of our sites. How that's going to affect us, I really don't know, but it is pretty interesting how that's been forced through by just a handful of people.
Well, we appreciate you coming over to Radio Sputnik today, Alan McLeod. We're not going to blacklist you here anytime soon. You'll always have a voice and a space to share your reporting, which is always excellent. That was Alan McLeod, author, journalist, and media analyst. Alan, where can people find more of you and your work online?
Yeah, check me out at Mint Press News or Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or just follow me on Twitter, Alan, A-L-A-N-R, McLeod, M-A-C-L-E-O-D.
Alan McLeod, thank you so much. Before we do turn to our next break, I wanted to slide in one patient caller, one of our favorite regular guests, DJ. DJ, you're on the line. I heard you want to talk about your good friend, Joe Biden. What's on your mind today, DJ?
Yeah, think that there's anything that Joe Biden could do that would make me vote for him, even with Bernie Sanders at this point. Joe Biden has had 40 years to affect some sort of positive change in the United States, period. Not just in the black community. He's been disastrous for the black community. But if Donald Trump himself was to take Joe Biden's advice and shoot me in the leg, he would have done me and everyone like me that I know harm. I cannot imagine any circumstance where I would vote for Joe Biden. He's an awful
I was about to
human
ask
being.
you that, DJ. Is there anything at all that Joe Biden comes out, gives this kind of mea culpa on everything that he ever did wrong, including private moments that you wish he would just keep to himself? And he said, I did all of this stuff wrong. I'm going to take on a new leaf. I see all of these people out protesting. I am just going to give it to the crowd, and I'm going to back all of these policies. Would that be enough for you to be like, okay, fair enough?
No, you have to have action. You can't just speak. You're going to do something. If somehow he managed to get a bunch of people together and convince everyone, hey, let's take the exception to slavery out in the 13th Amendment, I'd vote for him. But in that same vote for Trump and a MAGA hat, he did that. Anyone who did something that actually helped my community, not just my community, America, that would help the economy, because you have companies that wouldn't be able to just pump jobs into prison. That would have those jobs would have to go to the community, to people. Remove incentives of people who are sending jobs overseas, force them to stay here, and prevent them from sending those jobs into prisons for free labor.
I like the question there, Jamal. If Joe Biden turns into the movie Bulworth,
right,
then all of a sudden says the complete truth the next 4 months, we've been in a radical place. Maybe even I would vote for Joe Biden if we got to that point. DJ, let me ask you real quick before we turn to our break. After the break, we're going to talk about Dave Chappelle's latest stand-up special. Did you get a chance to see it?
I got a chance to see it. I got a chance to see him when he's not being so high funny. It just, it was amazing. I like that he just touched that point to say, hey, I think you guys are doing a great job, and we don't need any of this grandstanding and a bunch of famous people to speak to these issues that I personally don't experience anymore. I'm sure he has those experiences still as a black man in the United States, but it was great. I loved it.
Yeah, wonderful. We'll talk more about that after the break. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. We'll talk about Dave Chappelle's latest stand-up special titled 846. 202-521-1320. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Political Misfits.
Political Misfits who?
Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik.
Not ringing a bell, sorry.
News, politics, culture, cutting through the red and blue spin to get to the real story. From noon to 2 p.m. Eastern at 105.5 in Washington, D.C.
Oh, it's Bob and Jamaro. Of course, come on in.
Aren't you glad you didn't say MSNBC?
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here.
Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. Time for our weekly Politics of Art segment.
A good one.
That intro music always sounds so artistic and peaceful. I love it, Jamal Thomas. Jamal Thomas, Bob Schlehuber here on Radio Sputnik, Political Misfits. We're here with you until 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we take a look at one of the latest pieces of art out there that's engaging and influencing the politics of our time and the politics that then surround that piece of art. This week, we look at Dave Chappelle's latest stand-up special titled 846, which was filmed in Ohio on June 6th and released to the public last Thursday. The 846 there, referencing the time of the length of time there that former Officer Chauvin in Minneapolis kneeled on and then killed George Floyd. A powerful number there, as Dave Chappelle explains throughout the show. If you had a chance to see the piece and you want to get in on the conversation over the next 20 minutes, give us a call, 202-521-1320. Jamal, for me, the piece was everything comedy should be. It should be rooted in truth. It should be rooted in socially and political relevance. It should take the form of the underdog against the broader injustices that communities are facing. This was Chapelle at his finest. I thought the piece was extra poignant on calling out the celebritization of our social discourse. In the piece, Chapelle talks about feeling stirred to speak after CNN's Don Lemon chided more celebrities for not speaking out in this moment. Chapelle explains in the piece he had no need to speak when millions of protesters across the nation already were taking to the streets and being heard. I love the piece as well for Chapelle that it took him to basically take on, it's allowed him in the piece here, Jamal, to take on outsized egos and people in our pop culture, including Candace Owens and Laura Ingraham at Fox News. It was Chapelle being the hero comedian he is suited to be. Jamal, I want to dive deeper into some of the politics around comedy and around Chapelle, but first let me ask you for your quick thoughts on the piece in general.
I loved it. It's Chapelle at his best. I mean, it's honest. Like, it goes beyond just this kind of social commentary. It goes into this kind of responsibility of an artist. And it's a social critique. It's a media critique in a weird way. But it's also him kind of like associating with something that's deeper than just this kind of shallow comedy and getting to this real honest emotion of it all. It's what art should be. It's awesome.
Yeah, and you know, it was interesting talking about like what art should be and kind of the erosion of comedy in many ways and stand-up comedians that I think a lot of the people, the Dane Cooks of the world, right, that just joke about dating girls and stuff, like that's what is funny. It's a lot of genital jokes. It's a lot of like lowbrow humor. It was interesting. The video that came up for me when I was watching the Chapelle stand-up on YouTube, the next video was George Carlin.
Yes.
And it was George Carlin talking about police lying, talking about how religion is a scam and attacking the state. I mean, that's comedy in its finest, and I think that's been lost so much from George Carlin to the nows and the comedians now. Even like Louis C.K., who is one of the highest comedy grossing comedians of my lifetime, especially one of the loudest voices in my generation until his downfall, obviously. But even Louis C.K. wasn't really tackling direct conflicts of religion, of state, of economics, and really going at the heart of people's existence. It would always kind of work around the edges. Yeah. And for in this situation, Chapelle really talking about what it means to be a man, to be a father, to be a black man, to be a black father, to be a celebrity, but also just be somebody that has neighbors in Ohio. It was great to see the complexities and depths of the comedian themselves, and then for him to go directly at the apparatus and systems. And I think this is kind of what DJ was saying, and for others were saying, it didn't punch down. It wasn't him looking at some of these issues like trans issues that really kind of turned me off. I didn't think he did a great job. I appreciate him trying to explore that and to learn, and I think he's actually evolved quite a bit. I'll give him that. But for this, it was really kind of the champion and hero for all of us. And I think that's so powerful that it wasn't just about the individual comedy and the individual comedian analyzing the situation, but he was speaking for a lot of people and really trying to let a lot of people hear into how he was seen. Jamal, I think, was so powerful.
Yeah, and it's a weird, like, it's an odd juxtaposition in a way, because you made the point before where he comes out and basically says, look, you don't need me to talk for you. By the same token, he kind of is. Like, it's a little bit of both. It's not him doing this in this kind of splashy way or this kind of self-involved way. It's more so like, look, you guys have been on the streets. You guys have been doing what you're doing. This is your thing. But then in the honest, like, grounding of what he's saying, to some degree, he is speaking for a lot of people who think the same way. And, like you said, using his mouthpiece to go after some of the people. Candace Owens' video was utterly trash. Trash is an understatement for that video. I mean, I watched that video, and she basically makes this weird argument where she gives this perfunctory, well, I mean, I'm not saying that because he did X or Y that he should have killed him. But the entire video is basically, he's a criminal, he's this, he's that. As if anything that went on, he could have been a murderer. It wouldn't have mattered. It is not the cop's responsibility to dispense maximum justice in a moment. So it's like this entire video was nonsense. So I love the fact that he was willing to kind of go there. And again, honest grounding. Like, he made of the point during it, during the video, he was like, well, this probably isn't really comedy. But it is. I mean, there were huge punchlines, even in the context of that kind of real honest emotion. Oh, and by the way, that's what I was going to say. When dealing with like Louis C.K. and some of these other people, it takes skill to craft this. Like, it's not... Like, it takes a certain honest exploration or introspection of self. It takes this kind of appraisal of your society. I remember in one of his comedy routines, he was making this argument about Trump and his supporters. And he was like, you stupid white person, you are poor. Donald Trump is working for me. Making this juxtaposition between race and class and how that's not necessarily a tether in the way that we would consider it a tether under normal circumstances. No, his comedy, he was at the top of his game in this, honestly.
Yeah, and I love the ripping apart Don Lemon too. Just like what seeing it. I mean, this goes back to the old joke he had about like 9/11 when they were like, somebody give me Ja Rule. What does Ja Rule think about this? Like, nobody cares what Ja Rule thinks about 9/11. Nobody cares what these celebrities have to say about this current moment. Celebrities are giving an outside voice, and this is why liberals are so dumb, so stupid. It's like, do you not realize that middle America and Republicans across this country hate you because everything is turned into this like Hollywood celebrity kind of fashion show for you, where everything is about how cool you are and how Broadway basically has turned white slave owners into black people on stage. What an incredible story. And everything is just like dumb, superficial, non-substantive politics where you have late night comedians making fun of how stupid Trump voters are. Yeah. This is why you continue to lose. By Don Lemon saying, where's the celebrity voice, and ignoring the people on the streets and the protesters, it's just absolutely absurd. And so I'm so glad Chapelle drew attention to that. Jamal, I'm also kind of curious. I mean, it was fascinating. Last week, we looked at the politics of art segment. We looked and talked to Billy Crenshaw, who was actually down at the protest here in Washington, D.C., talking about all the photography, the videos, and all of the art and graffiti that had popped up down at Black Lives Matter Plaza and down near Lafayette Park. And talking about how remarkable it was that there were so many professional artists speaking up in this moment. Right after we had reported that, there was a sign-on letter from 300 theater artists, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that was published, basically a statement addressed to white American theater decrying racial injustice in the industry. In that letter, it wrote, "You are all part of this house of cards built on white fragility and supremacy," as well as it said, "In this house, the house will not stand." So, Jamal, I think we're also going to see this kind of reckoning with celebrity culture, with American liberal white culture and art. I think this is a transformational moment, and I think Chapelle really kind of leads the way in that. He came out first and said, I'm going to talk about the rawness and pain in a very truthful way. I'm not going to come out like Comedy Central wanted me to put out my art so it can be commoditized. I'm not going to do the traditional, let's fill a big theater. I'm going to come out in Ohio, out in this open kind of yard. I'm going to do this really bizarre, weird social distance stand-up, but I'm going to do the art I want to talk about. I'm not going to layer it in jokes that you want to hear. I'm going to tell my personal story and weave the comedy into that. And I think we're going to see more and more Black artists, Indigenous artists, and people of color present and demand their art be seen like that. And I think audiences will eat. I mean, this is what Moonlight basically showed us, was that you could put out this kind of challenging new art that focuses on Black lives, that's not related to drugs or thuggery or crime, and just share and tell the story of being Black in this country. And I think Chapelle in the world of comedy really owned that through this special, and is really going to help drive that.
You know, this is why I say, to some degree, we're still trying to unmoor ourselves in this kind of weird Chinese finger trap from the issues of slavery, a kind of momentum of sorts. It deforms us in an odd way. Like, there is no absolute in regards to whether a film is going to be black, white, gay, straight, trans, whatever. But we do consider, in an odd way, white to be the normal and everything else to be relative to such. And so you would have a black movie. You know what I mean? Like, it's so bizarre when you look at it in those terms, even though there's no absolute. The movie is just a thing unto itself for this particular person who lives that particular life. So yeah, I get where you're coming from with that. Like, I think what we're seeing is this kind of rattling of our society. I think when those people, white and everything in between, saw Floyd die in that way. And God, man, I didn't even watch the entirety of the video. I mean, basically, you have somebody who's at the end of his life pleading for his mom. His mom is dead. And, that's a breaking of a man at that point. It's heart-wrenching. I think when the society saw that, they thought, I can't turn away from that. And in doing so, you have a lot of I can't turn away from, with this kind of moment opening up where your society is coming to a new norm. It's finding a new groove that it's going to fit itself in. And that's not necessarily an easy process. I mean, polling shift 20 points, like in a month. So it's like you had like, bam. And you have conservatives like, whoa, what just happened? What just happened? Like, your society is just incapable of dealing with the speed of that move. And the catch becomes, how does it deal with it going forward? What does it look like when people start going into the streets because they're out of a house? And that Black Lives Matter stuff becomes, Black Lives Matter for healthcare and for housing and by the way, as DJ made the point, that doesn't just help blacks. That's not specific to blacks. There's nothing that you're going to do and that says outside of reparations that is going to be specific to blacks. This is helping you also.
Well, and to Marianne Williamson's point, when I had got the chance to interview her last year, she said, actually, reparations for blacks would be also a stimulus for white America because then blacks would have more purchasing power to shop at the majority of white-owned businesses in this country. So it doesn't actually hurt white people to have more money go to the black community. Reparation can be a good thing for all people. People need to recognize this. I really appreciate your point there, Jamal. I do think this reckoning is having to happen so quickly. In many ways, it's been a slow, long process. How many dead bodies and painstaking images of family members crying and torn apart did America have to see before they had this kind of reaction, right? I mean, it's just like you said, we've seen this. Rodney King in 1991 had to be beat on live television for George Floyd 30 years later to matter when he died on the ground. We had to go through this kind of long arc to get there. And now what needs to happen is it needs to be written into the stone and the fabric of our societies that Black lives do matter. And to be able to do that, you really need to get into the cultural presentation, into the art, into the statues, into the paintings that hang in museums, the movies, the theater that's produced. Because right now, a lot of white America is struggling and they're scrambling basically to say, how do we call ourselves out and call ourselves white supremacists, but at the same time making sure we don't actually lose our positions of power? And so you're also going to see white America and the traditional powers that be basically try to hold on to those levers of cultural power. And I think, again, Dave Chapelle being that voice, and I really just appreciate the somberness of it, the bravery of it, the courage of it, to be one of those leading voices, because if he demands it, he's going to be able to get it unlike many other artists, and he can really pave the way. And so I think the whole art world is going to have a huge reckoning. And I don't think the artists that put out that letter gave me the chills, because it was very direct. It was very confrontational. And white America, they know what they're doing. White theater directors that have black actors just at the fancy dinner cocktail parties to do a quick reading to raise them a bunch of money for their white run theater, they know what they're doing. People aren't ignorant to what they're doing, and now they're being called out for it and having that spotlight shined on them. Jamal, I think this is a sea change that has been long in the working.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on that point. I mean, David Chapelle, there's a series called Politician. I love it. The lead character is gay. His friend basically offed himself, and in doing so, there's this kind of really wild philosophical introspection of what does it mean to be a person, and what does it mean to have what's in a person. And there's this back and forth that often happens. It's like, so how do you feel? It was like, I don't know. And it's like, so why don't you just pretend to be so-and-so? And it was like, is there a difference between it? Well, if you can't tell the difference, it doesn't matter. And it's like, what? But they're getting into this notion of what it means to be a person and what's in a person. And you can't fake it, right? You could try to fake it better. Chapelle wasn't faking that. And in fact, if he was, it would have never came out this way. Like there's a quality to it that rings true in a way that's, I don't know, maybe he's that good where it just comes across that way, where it's just like, bam, here's my act. I mean, I've seen him just walk on stage and, pick up a bottle and start doing comedy. But this was different. I mean, this was just, it had a different feel, quality, like you said, a somber tone to it. At the same token, simultaneously making humor out of it. Like, it was a really weird, awkward, but profound piece that was just monstrously good. I mean, it really was.
Check it out. Dave Chappelle's latest special there, now out making its rounds. If you get a chance to watch it later, shoot us a note on what you thought about it at Political Misfits on Twitter. 846 is the name of the title. Tomorrow, let's put a pin in it there for our weekly Politics of Art segment. We're going to turn to one last break before we come back with a few more stories we didn't want you to miss. You listen to Political Misfits live in D.C. We're back after this.
The most important hour of the day. It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Back on Radio Sputnik, we're bringing news, politics, and culture without the random treatment. I'm Bob Schlaber here with Jamarl Thomas. We got about 10 minutes left with you here, dear Misfits. After our show here, you have By Any Means Necessary, followed by Loud and Clear, and then Dr. Wilmer Leon will close the day out here for our new programming daily here on Political Misfits. Great shows later in the evening after that. You can catch all of us on the podcast platforms of your choosing. You can listen to us live. You always can give us a call, 202-521-1320. Or you always can leave us a note at Political Misfits on Twitter, or head over to the YouTube channel Political Progressive Soapbox, where you can check out great work from Jamarl Thomas, including Political Misfits there. Jamarl, there's so many places to listen to us. To get overly excited trying to list all of them out. If you want to listen to us, you can find us all over the internet. Maybe I'll just say that and shorten it in the future. We did have one caller who has patiently been waiting. I want to slide Chris in here before we get to a few other stories before we get out of here. Chris, thank you for waiting. You're live on the air with Political Misfits. What's on your mind?
Hello?
Yo.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about these masks because I've been listening to Sam, and it just drives me crazy. He seems to think that the masks are the end-all, be-all to this coronavirus. And
Wait,
they
who's
are
Sam?
not.
Wait, who's Sam?
You know, Sam Cedar.
Oh,
I
okay,
didn't want to drop
fair enough. One concentration camp less Sam Cedar. Fair enough. Go for it.
Right. So anyway, I've had training for asbestos removal, and it was an 80-hour course. I got a duffel bag full of literature from that course, and I can tell you that a dust mask will not stop anything. People putting on a dust mask makes you think you're safe, and then you're more willing to go out and about and possibly contract the corona. So I want to tell people that, you're better off to have a bottle of disinfectant than you are to wear a mask. So
Wait. One caveat. There's a caveat to that. Yeah, there's a caveat. So if it's not
Sam,
so much.
Sam, thank you for your call, Sam. I want to hear what you have to say here, Jamarl. Sam, thank you. Or sorry, you're not Sam. Thank you for the call here, Chris. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Chris. Go ahead, Jamarl.
So yeah, you need to put a caveat to that. Yeah, I agree with you that if the entire point of the mask was to basically protect you, then you might be right. But from the standpoint of people who are asymptomatic tends to produce less, apparently. And so in the context of that, having something like a mask on doesn't necessarily entirely protect you, but it does in some degree give some level of protection to the other person. At least that's what I've read, in my understanding of it. And it kind of makes sense intuitively, right?
Yeah, I saw it as more like the psychologically, you're then thinking more about social distancing. You're being more conscious to what you're doing with your hands, or your hands touching your face. It at least stops you from touching your face directly unless you remove your mask. And obviously people are like shown to do that all the time. It's more about these kind of like multi-pronged approaches towards reducing the virus. I think the America and these stay-at-home orders were just not well thought out. I think we just said stay at home. And if you leave, it doesn't matter if you leave. It's no different than doing anything if you leave. Just stay at home, as opposed to say like stay at home if you can, but if you have to go out, here's 10 different things to think about. Wash your hands, use disinfectant, cover your mouth, don't sneeze into your hand, sneeze into your elbow, like all of those things. And instead we were just so draconian and we just didn't know what was going on because the media doesn't. There's a number of reasons, Jamarl. Our media sucks. They don't know how to communicate. They went for the most sensationalized story. We don't have a great public health communication system to actually talk about how diseases are spread in the first place. The number of people that don't know how bacteria and viruses are actually spread between people is quite alarming in this country, and the need to wash your hands frequently anytime you're outside and then come back inside. The fact that many millions of Americans didn't understand the need for this was quite concerning. So no, greatly appreciate the call. I definitely obviously hear what he's saying. If the mask is the sole way in which we're going to get rid of the coronavirus, that's not going to be successful. Jamarl, I can either talk, if you want to talk a little bit about the civil rights ruling yesterday. We didn't get much of a chance there.
Let's hear that one.
Ruling. which is
thought that
quite
was really
incredible. And just the other headline, U.S. retail sales up a record 17% in May. But if you want to talk a little bit more about the ruling there at the Supreme Court yesterday, a 6-3 opinion written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, President Donald Trump's first Supreme Court nominee, and joined by Chief Justice and the 4 liberal justices, said LGBTQ workers were protected nationwide by discrimination. I want to pair this story, Jamal, with a report in 2018 by the Human Rights Campaign Foundation that found that 46% of LGBTQ Americans remain closeted in the workplace. There's over 30 states that, until the ruling yesterday, did not have protections for being fired under Title VII for gay and trans people. According to the report, of those who said they were closeted, 38% said they hid their sexuality because of the possibility of being stereotyped. 36% said they didn't want people to feel uncomfortable, and 31% said they worried about the possibility of losing connections or relationships with coworkers. Tomorrow, we're really fortunate we have a workplace that is very open and quite progressive in supporting its staff, and a workplace that prides itself on hiring the best writers and radio personalities, which has led to a really diverse cast of employees. I always have to check myself to remember this is not the same experience for so many across the United States. This ruling also reminds us the interconnectedness of so many social injustices. As this ruling was specifically targeting sexuality and sex, it obviously impacts and intersects with race and economic issues.
Yeah, in 10 years, we're going to be having this fight over male fragility. It's like, it's like that letter that was sent specific to race is going to be sent specific to sexuality, like my sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. That's what that feels like. I didn't realize that many states basically had no protections for that. That's obscene. I mean, whether I know some African Americans have this, and I've had this conversation with people where they were trying to make the difference between race and sex, and I would make the point to you that there may be a difference, but not materially in the sense of being able to understand the experience of having someone else who's been discriminated against. Your pain in that, and the thing that drives you or bugs you about that, should be the thing that connects you to the other person that's also experiencing that. Whether or not it's an issue of race or whether it's an issue of sexuality, discrimination and a person's inability to be who they want to be in their society is problematic. And, I don't want anybody discriminated against. It's, full stop. So,
and that's kind of the practice. Like, again, I can speak to my current employer with Sputnik Radio and the work we do. I think people also lose sight that when people hire, they often hire who looks like them and who they could be best friends with or like work best with, as opposed to the quality and the skill of that person's work. And so oftentimes you end up just with a lot of white dudes. If you see Donald Trump's White House press conference on the executive order around policing, just a bunch of white bros and one black guy in a sheriff hat up there. But you basically hire people that look like you. You don't actually hire who's best for your company. And so it's remarkable. This is kind of the intersection between race and economics, that people aren't necessarily concerned with what will make them the most money. They'll be racist and hire just white dudes. And I love the fact that I work at a company that hired the most talented people, that it wasn't looking at, we have to reach these quotas of diversity. Let's make sure we have a woman, a black guy, and a trans person. They hired who was best. And at the end of the day, when you actually then looked at who was best, it fit all of those demographics and ethnic markers that you would kind of shoot for the other way around. But it didn't have to sacrifice playing kind of identity politics to do so. It just hired who was most capable to fill that role. And that's something I'm really proud of. And it feels like a great win in kind of dark days to have this ruling here at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it is, right? I mean, because I think a lot of people would have looked at Neil Gorsuch and said, there's no way he's going to let that ruling go through. And, you look at Hobby Lobby and the fight over that. And even I was just looking at one of the religious leaders, very angry that he can't fire and discriminate against homosexuals now. And how weird is that, right? It's like freedom for who to do what? Well, I want the freedom to do what? To discriminate against. Well, it's like, I don't want to say discriminate. I want to use the term fire at will just because of their sexuality. That's what I want to say. I don't want to use the term discrimination. It's like, whether you want to call it white privilege or whether you want to call it white luxury or whatever that guy was trying to call it. I mean, it's the same thing, right?
Yeah. No, it's remarkable. And it's just remarkable, too, to see the arc of an injustice hopefully get rectified just a little bit. I mean, these marches and protests take 50 years to grab hold, and to have a win like that, a big shout out to all of those folks out there fighting for this. Shout out as well here to our guests today, Dr. Bill Hahnemann and Alan McLeod. Thank you so much for joining. We get out of here today. Big thank you as well to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team. Shout out as always to our producer, Michelle Whitty. On behalf of Jamal Thomas and myself, Bob Schleber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, as always, thank you for joining us for the show. Let's see. I'm trying to shut these windows. I thought this was a good show today. Even though we didn't have a huge number of people. I don't know where everyone is. But I thought the show was proficient. I thought everybody was good questions, lively. Everybody nailed their parts. So, thank you all for joining. I'm going to do a show almost immediately after this one because I want to talk about Trump's executive order. Because you must understand why Trump did that. It's not... Trump, for all intents and purposes, could have went into a room and said, I need you guys to write me up a bill that materially means nothing. And I want to go out and chest thump like I did something. And it would have been this executive order. It's nothing. It's a pointless endeavor. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, basically, you shouldn't use a chokehold unless your life is at stake. Do you know, you may not know this, Breonna Taylor, that no-knock warrant was illegal. It was illegal because the Supreme Court had already said it was illegal. Cops had a little bit of leeway where they could knock on the window and bang in the door. Because they would say, well, people had drugs and they were going to get rid of the drugs. But when they realized that, they were flagrantly abusing that, the Supreme Court got rid of that. Meaning that no-knock warrant for Breonna Taylor was illegal. What do you think? What do you think is going to take place? Oh, that black, I was terrified. He was so black. I had to choke the shit out of him. Everything is going to be life and death. The moment that a cop puts on a uniform, they're in a hostile world that is trying to take their life. That's the way they act anyway, right? Caged animals that we just kind of accept are vicious. It means nothing. It's performative. It's just theater. He just wanted to give a press conference. Those people will not be leaving the streets. Like,